rest of you, and we will hear what she has to say.
Thank you very much. I think the subtitle of my talk will be, can we kill enough weeds to be successful? I wasn't really sure whether someone working in sage scrub could have some lessons for people working in chaparral, but I see you have enough weed problems also. I've been working in the inland area, Riverside County, which we call Riversidean sage scrub. It's a little bit drier, a little bit more open canopy, a very high diversity of native forb species, and maintaining that native forb component has been the major goal of some of the local land managers and has been the focus of my research. So what we're going to look at is the potential for long-term restoration success of Riversidean sage scrub, also called inland sage scrub, invaded by grasses and forbs under anthropogenic nitrogen deposition, and also subject to frequent fire. And then I'll, since this is the implementation session, I thought I would talk about some of the different methods that we're using, one of them which is to assess the critical load of nitrogen deposition. I'll define that in a few minutes. And then finally, the message is that it is difficult to control these invasive species, and so what we may actually be doing is creating a lot of novel ecosystems. So I'll just start with a concept that's been around for some years, the alternative stable states or vegetation type conversion, where we have a series of impacts on our ecosystems. It could be invasions of several species, several fires, air pollution, and degradation. And then as we try to restore this, we see that there's this incredible effort required to return the system to its original stable state. And so this would be, so we get to state 4, and then we can't get back to the original vegetation. And under those conditions, so more recently, Richard Hobbs and colleagues have published a number of papers on what we call novel ecosystems, because it's so difficult to get back to our original systems. What we're creating now are species combinations, both of those that we plant in our restoration mixes, and then those invasive or weedy species that we can't control. And so we have a whole new flora on a site that wasn't there before. So I'm going to start with my nitrogen deposition story. Because of all of the automobile traffic, factories, and agriculture, we have deposition of nitrate and ammonia in California, so in Los Angeles Basin, in the Central Valley from agriculture. Much of this nitrogen deposition in the Los Angeles Basin comes from automobile emissions, NOx, that turns to nitrate up to 30 kilograms per hectare per year. The background level would be about So 30 kilograms per hectare is what a farmer would put on a small grain field, for instance. So this is significant amount of nitrogen coming in, and just like it makes small grains grow, it also makes exotic grasses grow. And so here's a view from Riverside, looking at the inversion layer over the Los Angeles basin, and that brown color that you see is NOx, nitrogen oxides. And then focusing in on Southern California, so this is where I've been working in the coastal sage scrub of western Riverside County, where we have gradients that go from 20 or 30 kilograms per hectare per year, and our low levels down here are only about 7 to 9 kilograms per hectare. If you want clean air, you have to go out to the desert anymore in Southern California. And what we're trying to find out is what is the nitrogen critical load. That amount of nitrogen above which there are negative impacts on an ecosystem. We can measure critical load as changes in organisms, for instance, loss of native species or increases in invasive species, changes in the soils, and changes in biogeochemistry. Today I'll just tell you about some changes in organisms. And you can't see that mouse pointer up there, so I can do both screens at once. So a recent analysis that we have done is looking, examining the Forest Service vegetation type map of the early 1930s, looking at the 2009 Google Earth vegetation, where we were interested in whether coastal sage scrub has converted to exotic annual grassland, or I should say Riversidean sage scrub, and in those areas that were grassy in the 1930s, or agriculture sometimes in the 1930s, whether any of them were able to recover to coastal sage scrub. So we only included those sites that had fired no more recently than 2003, giving them at least 6 years to recover to shrubland. And what we found out was, I know that you can't see the points on this map, and you probably can't even read the legend, so that doesn't matter. What's important here is that of the 150 or so points that we looked at here, 35% of the Riversidean sage scrub converted to exotic grassland, and for those that did not convert, there was a nitrogen deposition value of about 9.3 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And of those that were exotic grassland in 1930, about 23% of those were able to recover to Riversidean sage scrub. And again, the critical load was about 9.3 kilograms per hectare per year, which is a value that lies down here in about central Riverside County. So what we're seeing is much of northern Riverside County is turning into exotic annual grassland, and southern Riverside County is remaining coastal sage or Riversidean sage scrub. And this is what some of these sites look like. So here's a site near the Riverside campus, mostly exotic grasses. When you go down to the south, you've got really nice shrublands, very open shrublands, but the interspaces are still filled with wildflowers. And so we did a diversity assessment on a number of sites along there. So here's nitrogen deposition from 8 to 20 kilograms per hectare. We looked at species richness. This is forb richness. We had up to about 70 species per hectare, and what we found was that we had a pretty steep drop off in richness of native species. So corresponding to those sites, the very grassy sites, the sites that had high grass cover, had low cover of native forbs. And I know in this group you're all interested in the shrubs, the shrub data kind of followed the native forb data. I just didn't bring those graphs with me today. The shrubs also drop off so that you have, as I showed in this picture, these sites that are completely 100% exotic grasses and forbs in the high nitrogen deposition areas. So let's see, Megan showed us some nice soil seed bank data. What happens in these areas, this is an area now of low nitrogen deposition, around 8 kilograms per hectare at Lake Skinner. There's some nice coastal sage scrub that remains. There's exotic grassland. This area has been historically grazed, and one of my students went through and did a seedling count, soil seed bank, by doing greenhouse germination studies the way Megan did, and he found that the exotic grasses were about 7,000 in the grassland, and exotic forbs about 4,000, and native forbs only 400, and native shrubs 14. And so this is what our problem is. We've got a limitation of a native seed bank, and especially of the shrubs. And even in this residual shrubland, and this is some of the best shrubland we have in Riverside County, the exotic grasses are way more dense in the seed bank than the natives, and the native shrubs are very sparse in the seed bank. A fire came through this site a few weeks after he collected these samples, and so he did a compared burned and unburned, and what he found out was that after burning, the exotic grasses and forbs did decrease, and so this would be a very good opportunity for seeding native species. Right after the fire, the seed bank is depleted. And then people ask me, does nitrogen really affect the growth of these exotic grasses? We did a nitrogen fertilization experiment in an area of low nitrogen deposition, so this was about 7 kilograms per hectare per year. This site burned in the fall fires of 1993. This is down at Lake Skinner. Here's some nice recovery in 94, 96. The Lotus scoparius was coming in, and we fertilized this site with 60 kilograms per hectare per year, which is about twice as much that is coming in the northern part, polluted part of our gradient. And we added twice the amount because we were in a rush, because this site had been fertilized. The northern part had been receiving deposition for a long time. So what we showed here, then looking again at the native forbs, the native forb cover in the plus N plots was higher than in the control plots, and the exotic grass biomass was also higher where we added nitrogen. So there's not a great negative effect on the native forbs, but what was really interesting is that this exotic grass biomass has a high response to nitrogen fertilizer, and when we measured the biomass, what we had is 1 ton per hectare per year is what we considered the fine fuel load for carrying a fire across the grass, across the landscape. This is just a value that we got from the literature when fire managers set a grass fire. They say you have to have at least 1 ton per hectare to burn. And in the unfertilized plots, what we had is that in most years, the amount of fine fuel was below this amount, but in the fertilized plots, in many years, and especially in the wet years, there was a huge amount of fine fuel, so that some of those frequent fires that we're seeing in our area may be related to the high amount of grass biomass, exotic grass biomass. So next I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about restoration of some of these areas. 5 minutes, okay. And, so 5 minutes, okay. I won't have a lot of time to tell you about all of these different things. A number of these studies are published. We've used sheep grazing, various types of timed herbicides, dethatching. I won't go through this data set because it'll take 5 minutes just to go through this slide. But just to let you know that sheep grazing has to be so carefully timed, and we have such a droughty environment that in some years we simply do not have enough grass biomass for the sheep herders to consider it worthwhile. And in fact, when the sheep came out on this site, the first 2 years, there wasn't enough grass for them. They ate the shrubs, they ate the flowers, they didn't eat the grass. So sheep grazing is not always going to work in our environment on the large scale. We tried solarization, which works fantastically. We were able to kill the seed bank. We've tried herbicides. We've tried weed whacking. And solarization is a fantastic technique. The solarized plots were the best plots in terms of response to the killing the seed bank and getting native species up on this site. Herbicide, because it was grass specific, as we've already discussed, brought up the exotic forb, so a general glyphosate type herbicide would have worked better on this site. But what we found was that with solarization, we had the greatest establishment of native forbs compared to the herbicide treatment, compared to the mowing, compared to the control. One other thing that I'd like to say then is that one indicator of successful restoration would be that if you had a burn of coastal sage scrub, that coastal sage scrub should be able to recover. So one of my students, Nancy Sion, started a project in 1998, and in her plots got a nice successful establishment of coastal sage scrub. This is what the plots looked like in 2005. There were birds in these, shrubland birds in these plots, because this is a mountain in downtown Riverside that is, it's just mostly covered with grass now, especially the north-facing slope. We had a fire in October of 2008, and now these plots are back to exotic grasses. In other words, after the fire, nobody came in and controlled the grasses like Nancy did for her experiment. So there's no way that we're going to be able to maintain these shrublands without going in and doing continuous weed control. In another site in the San Jacinto Wildlife Area, we were able to plant mixes of forbs and shrubs, and we got some very nice successful establishment of shrubs. And over 10 years later, those shrubs still persist. The native forb mix that we planted there has disappeared, and it's been largely replaced by exotic grasses and forbs. The shrubs still persist in this site. There has been no fire on this particular site. So what we learned is that our restoration attempts to control exotic species are often temporary. We have to keep going back and reapplying our weed control efforts. For successful restoration, we're going to have to control nitrogen deposition in those areas where nitrogen deposition is high enough to increase the productivity of exotic grasses and increase the fire. For Riversidean sage scrub, we may have to consider this novel ecosystem idea. Even with intensive management, the local land managers are finding that they have an overstory of shrub with an understory dominated by exotics, and they have to work very hard to maintain the diverse native forb component. Thank you.
1996 studies at Lake Skinner
Yes.
that you referred to, I assume that was after the 1993 California fire.
It was the 1993 fire. We fertilized and then we've followed it ever since.
Yeah, we did some studies there after that fire at Lake Skinner, and one of the things we noticed, and I've never really understood what was going on, but in the 5th year after the fire, you may remember it was a very high rainfall year, and in that spring, there was a massive die-off of the plant formerly known as Lotus Scoparia.
Yes, that happened on our site too. I didn't show you the shrub data, but it's fairly typical for Lotus scoparius it's only got about a 5, 6, 7-year lifespan. One thing that we noticed is that in our fertilized plots, it died off a year or two sooner than in our unfertilized plots. So it didn't all die at the same time, but I think that's natural
all over
succession.
Southern California.
Yeah, and it didn't
die back in any other site but Lake Skinner. It was just massive uniform dieback of Lotus.
That's interesting. No, I didn't notice that except on my plots, as I said, it
Do you
died
know
back.
any pathogen that tends to attack it when it's a very high rainfall year?
No? No, I didn't see anything like that. Yeah, interesting.
We won't have any time for discussion, but we're running. That's fine, we just want to do that. We're about 20 minutes late. 12:30, that's the discussion, we still have one more talk, so we're time to.
Okay. Our next speaker is Alexandra Shepard. She's a research scientist at the Conservation Biology Institute. Her work focuses on fire science, ecology, and geography, as well as the effects of multiple threats and management alternatives on the persistence of native biodiversity under global change. Let's welcome Alex. Cipher. Cipher.
So this, I'm guessing forward, back. And pointer, all right. Yeah, I've already anticipated that this would be problematic. So a couple things. First, a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today, I did in collaboration with a couple of colleagues, Tess Brennan and John Cooley, who are here today, so I'd like to acknowledge them. I should also acknowledge Marty Witter for this photo. This is something that she took of the recent spring fire in the San Juan Mountains, right? Looks like it. Looks like it. All right. So, the wise man Confucius is known to have said, "The man who asks a question is a fool for a minute, but the man who does not ask a question is a fool for life." And I liked this because when Hugh asked me to talk about the role of fuels management in chaparral restoration, I thought a good way to approach it was through a series of questions. And the questions sort of revolving around the central question of, is there a role for fuels management in chaparral restoration? And that is followed by sort of this thought experiment, which is how my talk is going to be structured today, based on these questions. So one, what is the role of fire in chaparral? We've already talked about that quite a bit. But this is because fuels management is often conceived or thought of in the context of controlling fire. So given what we answer the first question with, the second question would be, well, in what ways could we use fuels management to aid restoration? What are the approaches that might work? And then the final question is, how effectively would fuels management serve these roles? And I even had more questions beyond that, but in the words of T.S. Eliot, "Oh, do not ask what is it, let us go and make our visit." Okay, so I could probably go over these slides really quickly because we've already talked about it a lot, but we all know that fire is a natural ecosystem process in Southern California. It's played an important role shaping ecosystem promotion and distribution of chaparral communities. And we all know that we've got a highly fire-prone landscape. Part of that is owing to the dense continuous canopy cover of the chaparral, and another is our Mediterranean climate. So we have 6 months of drought every year, and at the end of our summer drought, the fuel moisture is very low, and this tends to correspond with our Santa Ana winds. And so chaparral tends to burn in standard placing high-intensity wildfires, and large fires have historically occurred in the region. And as we've been talking about, chaparral species are resilient to fire, largely through their different post-fire response strategies. And the thing is that they are resilient to a fire regime. Historically, the fire return interval in chaparral was actually quite long, and fires returned approximately every 30 to 200 or some years. And so it's important, as we've all been talking about, to think of chaparral as resilient to this fire regime, because many of the species, particularly opposite cedars, are very sensitive to recurrent fire and short intervals between fire. And if short intervals between fire occur, it can lead to extirpation and replacement with exotic grasses that we've been talking about. It can actually potentially result in a positive feedback cycle, because these grasses are extremely flammable. They're like kindling. And so if you get more fire, you can have more extirpation, and so it goes. So why do we care about this? Well, in the words of Charles Bukowski, we are burning in water and drowning in flame. So what is a natural ecosystem process that's very important has now become a major threat. And why? Well, we have too much fire, partly because in the lower elevation shrublands where chaparral is, almost 95% or more of the emissions are caused by humans. And you can see in this chart, this is San Diego urban development for 4 years. It just exemplifies how, well, we've had a lot of population growth and we've had a lot of urban expansion, and as a result, we've had increasing fire. And there's actually projections that urban development and population growth will continue. This map here is obviously of the continental U.S., and I just put it in because I like it. It was developed by my colleagues at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's showing you housing density in 1940. I'm afraid to try the pointer. So the red, yellow, orangey areas are showing areas of higher housing density. So we can jump ahead 40 years, and this is what we have. Obviously, there's development. 20 more years, we've got even more. And if you add 30 more years, this is what is projected. So another wise man has said, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading. So, is this where we're heading? Are we heading toward a lot more development, and are we heading toward more and more type conversion because of too much fire? And what can we do about that? Now we get into the question of, well, what can fuels management do? So, I tried to think of all the different ways that fuels management could potentially aid restoration efforts. So the first thing is, well, are there any direct benefits of fuels management to chaparral? So first, we have prescribed burning, which is one of the common forms of fuels management. And in the context of restoration, well, we already have too much fire on our landscape. Most chaparral species are actually quite long-lived. Many live well beyond 100 years. And so the chaparral doesn't need to burn like some people think it does. So there's no real apparent benefit of prescribed burning for chaparral, and in fact, there's a high likelihood that there will be some detriment if it leads to high recurrence fire. So then we can think about fuel breaks or mechanical treatments. So in Southern California chaparral, unlike conifer forests, we don't have surface fuels. So in conifer forests, a lot of times fuel breaks or fuel manipulation involves thinning from below to get rid of the understory and prevent fires from reaching up into the crown and causing catastrophic crown fires. And so in these areas, fuel breaks are often considered to be mutually beneficial, not only for protecting structures, but also for their ecological benefits. But in the chaparral, it invariably involves removing the canopy. And so, really, it's not likely to be compatible with resource benefits. In fact, it's likely that it could cause some damage. And John talked about this quite a bit with exotic species, and we've been kind of talking about it for the last couple of days. So there's a lot of concerns about it. And this chart that I have, I just want to use the pointer, and I'm not. This chart is from Tess and John's mastication study, and it's just preliminary results. But I think the interesting thing about this is looking at different sites, control being, I think there was no treatment whatsoever. And what you see is if you repeat mastication, it has the highest number of exotic species. Oh,
It's a
pointer.
safe pointer to use,
Woohoo, thank you.
unless you point it yourself.
Right, which looks like I'm heading there right now. Now I'm gonna overuse it, overcompensate. So anyway, almost like with repeated fire, repeating mastication can lead to a lot of exotic species. Of course, a lot of times the whole purpose of mastication is to type convert. So, given that there aren't really any apparent direct benefits of fuels management for chaparral, the next question is, well, maybe there are some indirect effects, because fuels management is thought of in terms of controlling fire. So could you think about it, in John's words, as a resource sacrifice for the ultimate objective of controlling fire? And some possible ways you could go about this, having minimal ecological cost, is one, if you could maintain existing fuel breaks. So you're not creating new disturbance on the landscape. If you were to do some kind of spatial analysis and look at areas where there's threat of high recurrence fire, sensitive areas, maybe areas of old growth chaparral, and look at areas where there are existing fuel breaks there and maintain them. That's one option. Another option would be if you're putting in new fuel breaks, could you do it again in a spatial context in an area where they're likely to play a role in stopping fire or intersecting fire? They're in sensitive areas, and they may also be in areas that are strategic for structure protection. So you're sort of getting a lot of bang for your buck. So now that I've asked that question, let's move on to the third question. So thinking about fuel breaks in terms of indirect benefits of controlling fire, how effectively could it serve this role? So I'm going to show you a few slides with results of some studies that Tess, John, and I have done on the 4 national forests in Southern California. And the objective of our study was to understand what is the role of fuel breaks in controlling large fires, and what are the factors that most influence what this role is. And so this study consisted of GIS overlay and spatial analysis, looking at differences between fires that stopped at fuel breaks or fires that crossed fuel breaks over about 30 years, and also doing personal interviews. So Tess went around and interviewed firefighters who were at the scene for all of the fires and got their insight about what actually happened when the fires intersected the fuel break. So here's some results. So the slide on the left is showing you that most of the fires that happened in the third year, or in the 30 years, actually never intersected a fuel break, a very small proportion. So these red areas are looking at the number of fires and the proportion of them that intersected a fuel break. When they did intersect a fuel break is what I have on the chart on the right. So the red areas are they stopped at the fuel break. The green is they just blew right over it. And then the light green is areas where it didn't stop, but the fuel break did play a role in altering behavior. Or maybe it stopped at one part of the fuel break and crossed another. So in terms of the factors that influenced the success when it occurred, you don't need to look at all of these variables be controlled, and also the condition of the fuel break. It was good for the fuel break to be well maintained, so access was facilitated. Very few of the fuel breaks stopped on their own. It was really important to have firefighter presence. There was some variation among the forests, but these are the factors that came up again and again. So this is showing you the seasonal signature of what the outcome was. So in these red areas, you can see that the times that the fuel breaks and the fires did not stop at the fuel breaks was most of the time during September and October. It's really no surprise, that's when the Santa Ana winds occur. And you know, we're looking at an ember storm here, so you know, it's a really unsafe time for firefighters to be out there. Embers can fly, they can jump major freeways. So just a few comments from the interviewers, which really sort of reiterate what I just said, is most of the firefighters believe that the primary role of the fuel break is a safe anchor for suppression. It's not to passively stop a fire. And the top reasons that fires didn't stop at fuel breaks were there was not access to the fuel break, there were scarce resources and safety concerns when multiple fires are breaking out at the same time. The fires are, weather conditions. It all comes down to weather. And then finally, the maintenance of the fuel break is really important. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier is, well, maybe strategic maintenance of fuel breaks might be really one way that they can play a role. And sometimes fuel breaks didn't stop the fires, but they did play a role in changing the behavior of the fire so that the firefighters could get in and maneuver and buy some time for structure protection. Okay, so let's review our questions. So what is the role of fire? Well, it's an important ecosystem process, but the fire regime is changing and we have too much of it right now. How could fuels management work? Direct effects are probably going to be negative, but there's a potential of resource sacrifice for fire control. How effective is fuel management in serving that role? Well, the question comes down to, are you in normal weather conditions or are you in Santa Ana wind conditions? It's an open question. So how do we weigh these trade-offs? There's costs and benefits involved. Well, another question is, what else can we do? Considering that fire it's the threat that keeps coming up over and over again in all of the talks, it's clearly the greatest impediment to chaparral restoration, and it's really critical for chaparral conservation. So maybe we could combine fuels management with some additional strategies that would be aimed at not controlling fire, but actually preventing it. I mean, if 95% or so of the ignitions are caused by humans, then we would hope that humans might be able to somehow control the number of fires that we have. So you could do this. So some of the research that I've been working on recently is looking at analyzing ignitions to think about programs that would provide direct ignition reduction, targeted ignition prevention programs, which, at this point we don't really have any good models to follow, but I think if you're going to do that, you need to have a good understanding of why the ignitions are occurring, when they're occurring, and where they're occurring. And some preliminary analysis just provides some fodder for thought, and that this is just 10 years of ignitions in San Diego County, and it's looking at the top causes of fire ignitions, an area burned, and number of fires. Well, there were 3 kinds of ignitions that resulted in the most area burned: power line, equipment, and miscellaneous. And we can look at the season of when these different causes of ignitions resulted in their fires. And of course, those 3 top causes of area burned, surprise, surprise, they happened in Santa Ana season. I think I have another ignition slide, so I'll talk about land use planning in a minute. So the other thing that I think would be useful if you're thinking about ignition prevention is to think about where. So many ignitions happen close to roads. We all know that. But different sources or causes of ignition actually have different spatial patterns associated with them. So an example here, you can see where most of the campfire ignitions are occurring. By the way, these are predictive maps I developed that are similar to species distribution modeling. So maybe, since we know that campfires usually happen in July, and they usually happen in this area, we could have targeted education campaigns in those times and places. Okay, land use planning. I'm coming close to the end of the talk. So the idea with land use planning is that study after study, and not just the studies that I have listed here, but studies from other places around the world, are consistently showing that fire frequency is highest when there's intermediate levels of housing density or population. And here's just some examples from our work. This is looking at model results. The probability of ignition is in this low to intermediate structure density. A study of housing loss in San Diego County, same signature, low to intermediate housing density. This is looking at the proportion of wild and urban intermix and the number of fires relative to that. Again, most frequency, intermediate housing density. We also are working on a study that shows, we looked at future projections of development, and if you were to use land use planning and use infill type development as opposed to leapfrog or expansion, after 30 years it could result in significantly lower proportions of homes predicted to be destroyed. Also, this could provide habitat benefits because you aren't consuming as much land. So just quickly, to explain why we think this is, so we're in a human ignition area. Most of the fires are caused by humans. So if there aren't a whole lot of humans, at low housing density, there's not a lot of fire. If you have a whole lot of humans that could potentially cause a fire, that also tends to happen in really high density housing areas where there's not a lot of fuel. So that's why we think that there's something going on here with, just the right mixture of fuel and people to have a lot of fires happening. So, in conclusion, I think, and it goes with what everybody's been saying, is that chaparral restoration and conservation really needs to take into consideration fire and high recurrence fire. Fuel management likely has no direct benefit for restoration, but there is a potential that it could have an indirect benefit of reducing fire. Some ideas would be to look at where existing fuel breaks already are in strategic locations. An open-ended question is, well, is this resource sacrifice worth the trade-off? And to get to that question, we need to think about weather conditions and when fuel breaks are going to control fires and when they're not. Other alternatives, such as ignition prevention or planning, also, I think, deserve a little more thought as we move forward. So, to end, it is better to debate a question without settling it than to settle a question without debating it.
Should we just do a 10-minute question answers with everybody?
We've got about 5 minutes. So we can do that.
Okay. Could the other speakers come up and we will handle questions for about 10 minutes before everybody's so faint from lack of food, we will disperse to lunch.
Okay,
I'm going to start here with Russell. Great. Question for Edie, and if you could talk a little bit about how the nitrogen is cycling through these systems where you have these, high anthropogenic loadings, and is nitrogen accumulating in the soil and the biomass? How is it moving to the atmosphere? And how, when fire comes through, does that change or reset where the carbon is residing?
That's a lot of questions. Nitrogen does accumulate in the soil. With leaching, it will go down to, we found it down to about 1 meter. What we're doing with our studies is we actually stop fertilizing after 10 years, and we're watching the soil surface nitrogen gradually deplete, and it's actually, the fertilized and the unfertilized plots about maybe 5 years after we stop fertilizing, we're the same, although we still do have nitrogen at depth, and it's going to take a longer time for that nitrogen at depth to leave the system. But I think finally this year, for the first time, we did not see a difference in the biomass of exotic grasses in fertilized and unfertilized plots, so, you know, about 6 or 7 years after fertilization. And so other studies have shown that if you stop fertilizing, the nitrogen does go down in the soil. And that's why we keep going back to the regulatory agencies and we say, okay, if you can get the nitrogen deposition down to below critical load, eventually our ecosystems will clean themselves up because nitrogen is mobile in systems. As far as fire, fire does remove a certain amount of the nitrogen, and that's going to help. Although, of course, as we know, if you have continual added nitrogen from nitrogen deposition, the fire removal effect will be negligible in the long term until you clean up the air.
We have another question right here.
There was this is for Alex. I was reading a recent paper, and I don't know if you were a co-author on it actually, but it was about looking at burn scars in big cone Doug fir, and that they noted that the local,
Man's right over there.
Yeah, the author of that paper is in our audience.
So the local fire return interval for the Los Padres was 11 years and 13 years. And so I was wondering, were those big cone Doug fir sites in the Mount Pinus area, or were they at higher elevations, or, because that would seem to indicate that our fire return interval was about a dozen years.
Most of the sites were 3,000 to 4,000 foot in elevation. So the sites that are more surrounded by chaparral, not so much the bunners that go up to mixed conifer. About half the samples are from the Nordoff Ridge area,
Okay.
so Mount Pinus. And regarding the return interval, depending on the size, I mean, what we're really trying to look at is larger fires, big mega fires. And that lower return interval is for fires that were